Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Last week I did a video on a short summary of a podcast that I'm listening to on Amazon Music. It's called The Girlfriends. In that video, I just did a brief summary of what the podcast is about and introduced you guys to some of the characters in the podcast. If you haven't taken a look at that, please go ahead and watch that video and come back to this one. In this video, we're going to be doing a deeper dive of the podcast as a whole. I'm going to do this in two parts. The first part is going to cover episodes 1 to 4, and the second is going to cover 5 to 9, which is the final episode. Let's talk about it. In the podcast, our story begins in 1989 on New Year's Eve at a party in Las Vegas. The party is being hosted by Gina, who is known for her extravagant parties. Gina's brother, who is in real estate, invites some investors to the party, most of which are in the medical community. Now, if you watched my last video, you'll remember that Bob is a surgeon, so he's part of this medical community. And he has just recently moved to Las Vegas, so he's obviously the most eligible bachelor at this party. Bob was invited to the party by his childhood friend who recently convinced him to move from New York to Las Vegas. At the party, all the ladies want to get to know Bob. They want to talk to Bob. They want to see what's going on with Bob. But another lady catches his eye. Her name is Stephanie. She's introduced to Bob by Gina, who's the host of the party. They hit it off and start dating. Like I said in my last video, Bob was perfect on paper. So from the outside looking in, their relationship seemed perfect. He would fly her out, he would buy her all kinds of expensive gifts. They just seemed perfect together. Eventually, they get engaged, but the engagement is called off after a few years. This is the first lady that we know about in Las Vegas that Bob dates. In comes Mindy. Mindy is introduced to us when she tells a story about bumping into Bob in a parking lot at their job at the hospital. She finds Bob attractive, but at the time he was with Stephanie. So she gets to know him, becomes a little bit friendly with him, and that's about it for a few years until the engagement is broken off with Stephanie. When Mindy hears about this, she's like, I'm comfortable with Bob. I kind of know him. So when he asks her out on a date, she's like, sure, I'll do it. I'll go out on a date with you as friends. They go out on a few dates, but after a while, Mindy notices some red flags. She's like, I don't really like you, man. So she makes a run for it. But not before she introduces him to one of her girlfriends, Carol, who, if you remember, is actually the one who tells the story in this podcast. She's the host of the podcast. Carol acknowledges that she finds Bob attractive as well. So Mindy's like, you know what? He didn't work out for me, but you two might hit it off. So she gives Bob Carol's number and those two start talking. So a lot of the story is told in Carol's perspective, but this part is about when she dates Bob. Carol details her first date with Bob and how they talk about a lot of things. She does, however, notice that he doesn't really talk about his past much. And this is when she jokingly says, what did you do? Murder your wife? Bob doesn't say no. Bob doesn't say, what on earth are you talking about? Bob's response is, why? What do you know? Excuse me? What? He goes on to tell her that his ex-wife went missing and he was accused of murdering her. And he's like, but please don't tell anyone about this. I tried to leave all this behind in New York. No one in Las Vegas knows about this, so please don't tell anyone about this. Instead of freaking out and bolting it out of there, Carol's like, okay. And she kind of sticks around, gets to know Bob even more. They go on a few dates. They start dating for a few months. But in that time, a lot of red flags start popping up. When you listen to the podcast, you'll hear all the stories, but one of them is when he accused her of giving him syphilis. He flew her out somewhere, they went somewhere together, and he was acting off the entire time. Eventually, she's like, so what's really going on? And apparently he holds his hands up and he's like, look at these spots on my hands. You gave me syphilis. And she's like, what are you talking about? I didn't give you syphilis. I don't have syphilis. But he just goes on this rant that she gave him syphilis, only to find out later, actually, that he had contact dermatitis. It wasn't syphilis. And Carol says Bob didn't even apologize after he found out that it was contact dermatitis. Anywho, after a while of dating, Bob is the one who breaks up with Carol. It was actually 6 months after dating. And this is when Carol meets up with Mindy to gossip about her relationship with Bob. She's like, I listened to all his stories. I was accused of giving him syphilis, and I didn't leave this man, and he's the one who broke up with me. So she's just going to Mindy to vent and to talk about all the terrible things that Bob did, and he's the one that ended up leaving her. Like, girl, what? She's there just venting to her girl about all of this. And in that time, she then tells Carol about Bob's missing wife. Her name is Gail. After hearing the story about Bob's ex-wife, Mindy doesn't let up. She starts doing research on Bob. Now, this is in the year 1995, so it's not like Mindy can go to her computer and Google Bob killing his ex-wife Gail type of thing. She has to go to the library. She has to do searches in the library. She has to search through newspapers. She goes searching, and you know what? It was worth it after all. She finds a few short articles which pretty much sum up what Bob told Carol. But she's like, I'm convinced Bob killed his ex-wife. And at this time, Mindy is now engaged to another gentleman, and she goes and tells her fiance, and they're both convinced that Bob killed his ex-wife. They're both true crime people, and they just love digging up a story. They do jokingly go back and forth, sharing hypotheses on how it happened. They watch a movie and they're like, that's how he did it. They hear this, they hear that, they're like, that's how he did it. But they're just joking around about it. Over time, Carol starts getting stories about Bob from women who were in his past. Not necessarily women who dated him, like she speaks to a receptionist that worked with Bob once, and she speaks to a few of his exes, and they all kind of detail this kind of abusive, kind of strange red flags in their relationships. And one of the women that Carol does speak to is Stephanie. Now, if you remember, Stephanie is one of the first ladies that dated Bob when he came to Las Vegas. Stephanie eventually joins the group of two ladies, Mindy and Carol, and they trash talk Bob. They just continue to trash talk Bob and how terrible he was and all sorts of things about him. But this starts happening more and more often. The ladies start meeting up a lot more often. They share a lot more stories. They come up with all kinds of theories about what happened. But they're just doing this as banter. It's not really that serious for them yet. This part is told by Gail's sister, Elaine, some of Gail's friends, and some of her family members. Elaine tells us about Gail's childhood and life before she met Bob. Fortunately, Gail didn't have a happy-go-lucky kind of life. She did hit a low point in her life at some point. She tried to commit suicide, she had chronic depression, and she had to move in with her sister. So because things were not going so well for her, one of her friends was like, hey, you know what? Let me try cheering you up. I'll set you up on a blind date with one of my husband's friends. His name is Bob. Get to know him, see how you feel. He might cheer you up a little bit. So Gail meets Bob, she likes him, and they start dating. As they're dating, in the time that they're dating, red flags start popping up. It turns out that Bob is actually a little too controlling, but she likes him, so they continue dating. They actually get engaged after about a year of dating. Now they move in together, and Gail has this cat, and one day she notices that Bob is in the bathroom and she's hearing a sound. She frantically goes in, finds out what's happening, and it turns out that Bob is trying to drown the cat. Why is he trying to drown the cat? Because he's jealous of the cat? Like, anywho, turns out Bob is jealous of her cat. And instead of being like, I'm out of here, Gail gets rid of her cat. She tells her sister that I'm going to get rid of my cat because I want to show him just how much I love him. And her sister jokingly, but not so jokingly, says, how about we get rid of Bob instead of the cat? And I'm with her on that. Time goes by and they eventually get married. Once they get married, Bob is doing his residency, so he's working long hours, and Gail is at home. She's kind of bored, she's lonely, she feels neglected, and she starts up an affair with two guys that her sister can recall. This is only important a little later on in the story, so bookmark that for now. Another thing we hear about Bob is that he hates smokers. He hates smokers so much that one day he came home early and walked in on Gail smoking, and he was so upset that he jumped over a couch and grabbed her neck and strangled her to a point of unconsciousness. When Gail told her sister about this, her sister Elaine was like, you need to report this. And surprisingly, she did. She did give a police report, but unfortunately, it was never followed up on. The police were just like, thanks for your report, but that's about all we're going to do about it. A lot happens throughout their marriage, and Gail is kind of in and out of wanting to fix things with Bob. They go to therapy at some point. They go to therapy together, individually. But she's also like, I kind of want to leave him because I don't like what I'm dealing with at home. She details all this to her sister, Elaine. Eventually, she decides, I'm going to leave Bob, and tells Elaine that she received a letter from Bob's psychiatrist warning her that he was dangerous and he was going to kill her. She was going to use that letter as leverage in the divorce. She did want Bob to support her studies even after they divorced. So she was like, I'm going to use this as leverage. I'm leaving you, but I need your help. So I'm going to keep this letter as leverage. Now, listen. I got that letter from a psychiatrist. I'm out. I'm not using it as leverage for anything. Bye. That's me though. So Gail speaks to one of her friends and she's like, you know what? I'm going to get a divorce from Bob finally. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make him some dinner. I'm going to sit him down. I'm going to tell him everything that I have, like this letter from the psychiatrist. And I'm going to tell him I'm leaving him. This is the night Gail goes missing. Elaine finds out her sister is missing when she calls her parents to let them know that she's heading back to law school. They tell her that Bob said she went out for a jog and he hadn't seen her since. Elaine's red flags start going up. She's like, something's not right. Like, if my sister was going somewhere, if she was running away, if she was leaving him for another man, she would have definitely called me first. So what is going on? The family starts frantically searching for Gail. They call a cousin in New York, they call everyone, and they start going out looking for her. They have a search that's held for her. They hand out missing posters. They're just looking for Gail. Where is she? Like, Bob says she went for a jog, so what happened to her after that? About 30 hours after Gail goes missing, Bob finally files a police report. Now, it could be argued that if he had immediately gone and filed the report, the police would have said, wait 24 hours, which is what we usually hear in these cases. But can we also ask the question, why didn't he go sooner? That's something to think about. But anyways, he tells the police that him and Gail had gotten into an argument right before she went out for a jog. Everyone just starts searching for Gail. The police are searching for her. Her family is searching for her. Bob is a part of this search. And he also does some interviews with some television stations to kind of help anyone out there. Do you have any information? After a while, Bob starts coming up with theories about where Gail could be. He tells people about her drug use, and that's what could have possibly got her in trouble. And remember those 2 affairs I was talking about? Yeah, he starts making speculations that maybe she ran off with another man. Maybe that's what happened. I don't know. She's got a lot going on. So Elaine is obviously one of the people telling the story from Gail's perspective. But in this part, we are introduced to her a little bit more. We find out what she's doing to help find her sister and how her life kind of falls apart because she is adamant to find her sister. So first of all, Elaine is convinced that Bob either killed her sister or he hurt her very badly and she's somewhere where she can't get away. Elaine was actually weeks away from sitting for her bar exam. She was studying to be a lawyer, and she decided not to write it. And instead, she put all her energy into proving that Bob killed her sister. She was like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. I know he did it, and I'm going to find out. So in the meantime, Elaine offers to pick up Gail's belongings from Bob and Gail's apartment because she's not there anymore. So let me go get some stuff from there. And she's doing this in hopes that he'll break down and maybe when he sees a piece of clothing, he'll fall apart and start telling her everything that happened. But that's not what happened. When Elaine gets to the apartment, Bob is already has everything packed up in trash bags. And he's like, here, go. Take your sister's stuff and go. So yeah, Elaine is like, you don't want anything? You don't want to keep maybe her perfumes? Nope, take it and go. Initially, Bob is very cooperative with the police, with the family. Like I said, he was doing the searches with them. And then eventually he's like, no. He becomes very uncooperative. And he stops answering phone calls. He stops speaking to the family altogether. This makes Elaine very upset, and she gets more adamant to find out what really happened to her sister. She's determined to make sure that everyone in Bob's life knows about what happened to her sister and that he had something to do with it. She sends letters to people. She sends letters to Bob's apartment, like people who live in the same apartment building as him. And this does bring about some leads. Like one of the ladies that lives in the apartment, she's like, I heard them fighting all the time. What's strange about the night that Gail went missing is it was silent. But I did hear a lot of furniture moving around. So to Elaine, she was like, that's a lead. She took that to police, but unfortunately they felt like that's not enough evidence to arrest someone. Like one night, it was a quiet night. So what? We're arresting you because of that? And the police also felt like they weren't finding enough evidence to really arrest him for anything. So they eventually dropped the case. Elaine was adamant though. She did not let up. All her hard work did somehow pay off because it gets the case passed on to the district attorney's office. But after a while, even they dropped the case. They're like, we just don't have anything on him. When Elaine realizes that not much is going to be done legally, she begins a different campaign. She's like, you know what? It's personal now. And she starts calling Bob's apartment religiously. And he's not answering, but she's leaving voicemail messages to the tune of, "You killed my sister, and everyone is going to know about it." And she does this religiously. She doesn't stop. She may not call tomorrow, but she'll call the next day. She's constantly calling Bob saying, "You killed my sister, and everyone's going to find out about it. For as long as I live, I'm going to be calling you, and everyone's going to know you killed my sister." You go, Elaine. But her messages go unanswered. Bob says nothing. He just moves on with his life, He's not talking to her, he's not responding to her messages. After 3 years of doing this, Elaine finally stops her quest. She's like, "You know what? It's time I live my life. It's about time I go out there and just stop. Let me stop being mad at Bob. Clearly nothing is about to happen with this." And she travels, she gets married, and she has children. But 4 years after Gail went missing, a torso is found on a beach in Staten Island. It just floats up on the beach, and it's clear that this torso has been in the water for a very, very long time. They start doing tests on the torso to find out if it is Gail, but it's just so badly decomposed that it's not easy to identify this torso. Elaine remembers that Gail took some x-rays a few years ago, and she hopes that they can help identify this torso. With those x-rays, they do eventually identify the torso as Gail. Unfortunately, they just don't find any other parts. They just have the torso. But the family can, at the very least, lay her to rest. So episode 4 does end off on a really bad note. And unfortunately, this is where I'm going to leave it too. I will be back with part 2 of this review of the Girlfriends podcast. I'm hoping to have it out by next week, Monday. So please come back and check out my channel. In the meantime, drop in the comment section. Let me know, have you listened to the podcast? What do you think? And let me know what you think of this review if you have already listened to the podcast. Please like this video, share, subscribe to my channel, and come back next week for part 2 of the review of the Girlfriends podcast. Thank you.